Oh, okay. So it'll looks like we'll have a recording. We can do with it what we like. I don't think it gets shared automatically, but
yeah. I think
the webinar here. So more people will funnel in, but I just wanted to thank everybody who's on already for joining Hashbranch's first webinar. My name's Tom Merkel. I'm the CEO of Hashbranch, and for those of you who don't know, we're a marketplace for finding the most quality hosting solutions for your Bitcoin miners. We're really on a mission to create a thriving proof of work industry here in the US and abroad. But, so it's our pleasure really to have people like Dennis Porter, who will introduce himself here in a second, working tirelessly to really push for positive legislation in and around this new industry. And he, with his work at Satoshi Action Fund, they've done a lot of great things. And I think there's a lot more coming down the pipeline. So without further ado, in this webinar, you'll hear specifically on how Bitcoin mining really can positively impact our environment, local economies, and the infrastructure around the electrical grid. Dennis is going to dive into the current political climate around this industry, some of the successes and things that he's done at Satoshi Action Fund, and then the long road ahead and what things look like out into the future, specifically for Bitcoin mining here in the US. So we'll have an open Q&A running the entire presentation, and it looks like Eric already has hopped in there, so appreciate that. And what we'll do is we'll try to do our best to answer all these questions kind of near the end of Dennis's presentation. And I think we should go from there. So again, thank you all for joining, and I will hand it off to Dennis now.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I very much appreciate you inviting me to participate in this webinar. It'll be the first webinar I've done. I've obviously done lots of panels and participated in a good bit of content. And I've also given this presentation to many different folks. This is the same presentation that I have given to state government organizations, to folks on the Hill in DC during my Senate Finance Committee hearing room briefing, and also to state policymakers all across the country, members of Congress across the country who have been willing to hop on and listen to this briefing and parts of this briefing. Oftentimes they don't get the whole 40-minute, members of Congress anyways don't get the whole 40-minute presentation. They're in quite a rush. But you'll get the whole 40-minute presentation today. So really appreciate everyone hopping in. And yeah, as Tom said, at the end, feel free to ask some questions and save them up for then, or even pop them into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. It's probably an appropriate way to go after this stuff. So as Tom mentioned, I'm the CEO, co-founder of Satoshi Action Fund, which is a advocacy organization that focuses on Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. We go typically state by state and try to educate folks on the benefits of Bitcoin mining. And then we try to turn around and tell those policymakers and legislators, like, okay, now that you love Bitcoin mining as much as I do, you see the value of it, you see the potential of it, here's some legislation that we would love for you to take a look at and possibly introduce. We've had a lot of success with that approach. Our approach has just been, this stuff is good for jobs. Bitcoin mining is good for jobs. It's good for local investment, grid stability, environmental cleanup, and the ability to enhance green and carbon-free energy projects. There isn't a policymaker in the country who, when they hear those things, doesn't want to know more. And so once they want to know more, we get them that policy and we get them to move it along. So far, the most popular bill has been our Right to Mine bill, which is really just trying to protect Bitcoin miners from any sort of discrimination. So far, we have had multiple states, state governments, local governments, try to attempt to successfully discriminate against Bitcoin miners. That has been done through various ways. Some has been zoning changes, like in Missoula, Montana. Some of you might be familiar with that case, where they called an emergency meeting and essentially said that this technology is bad for the environment. And so we're going to figure out a way to help kick them out of the local town. And so they zoned miners out of that area, which led to millions of dollars of losses by the miner there, who was a good operator, in fact, who came to testify in Montana when we pushed that policy. So that's one form of discrimination. There is also discrimination where people are facing rate changes, which is Tom is very familiar with that happening in Idaho. And then also noise complaints, which is a huge one. We get these frivolous noise complaints all the time from folks in the town. And most of us out there, especially the good operators, are more than happy and willing to try to mitigate any sort of noise in the process. So that bill, the Right to Mine, has passed the House and the Senate in Arkansas and also in Montana. And we're hoping to have it done shortly here in Missouri as well. And then we've got a couple other pieces of legislation in Texas and New Hampshire that are moving along. But I'll if you want to learn more about all that, feel free to hit me up, and I'm happy to go on a call and dive deep on all the work that we're doing there. But I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation for you guys. So thank you everyone again for joining. It's great to have, we've got 16 people here this morning on tax day. So thank you all of you for hopefully you got your taxes done, and hopefully that doesn't spur you to jump off the call and get it done. Today's the last day. Let me see. I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. All right. So I love this presentation. It's my favorite. It's our bread and butter at the Satoshi Action Fund. So I'm going to jump right into it. We already covered a little bit about the organization, so I'm just going to skip over this slide. But just for briefer, we are a nonprofit, so we're not a business. We there's no shares. All the money that we take in goes into helping to spread Bitcoin, pro-Bitcoin legislation, pro-Bitcoin education. We're also nonpartisan, so we work with Democrats and Republicans across the aisle. I don't need to get into the basics, I don't think, too much with this audience, but I'll share this section with you as briefly as I can, because I think it's important for when you go out and you speak to anyone out there, whether it be your friends or family, policymakers, regulators, tell them what Bitcoin is. And this is the way that we explain it to them. And so far, we've had a lot of success. So Bitcoin is two things. It is money, and it is a payment system or payment rails. In the past, those two things were separated. So you would have, over here, dollars and Visa, MasterCard, PayPal could be down here at the bottom. And those have always been separated. Well, now, for the first time in history, we have a payment system and a form of currency that are combined into a single network. One thing to keep in mind for Bitcoin and how it functions is that it needs data centers to be able to support its work. Very much like the internet needs data centers for you to be able to send cat videos, for you to jump on this webinar and participate in this call today. Everything that we do on the internet, all the benefits that it has to offer, are all supported by these data centers are required in order for those functions to happen properly. And that's the same exact thing with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, in order for it to secure billions of dollars of value globally, in order for it to send payments across borders, in order for it to be secure, you need Bitcoin data centers. And just so as a primer to keep in mind, I say Bitcoin a lot. Obviously it's a digital asset mining. It's called virtual currency mining. There's a variety of different terms that people have used, proof of work mining. The reason why I typically say Bitcoin mining is because Bitcoin accounts for roughly 94% of all proof of work within the mining space. Two primers that I like to share before I jump into the details is that Bitcoin mining is a data center business that also duals as a piece of energy infrastructure. The other one is that Bitcoin mining acts as a piece of energy infrastructure, which can help you achieve your energy goals while also improving the economy and lowering emissions. How does Bitcoin mining improve our energy systems while improving the economy and lowering emissions? There are 5 key benefits to Bitcoin as a technology, Bitcoin mining as a technology. The first one being that it can provide jobs, local investment, it can have grid benefits, it can clean up the environment, and it can enhance green and renewable energy projects. And obviously, I'll get into the details on each of those. First one, jobs, simple. A lot of the folks here are probably working in the industry, so you very clearly understand the potential of the jobs that are coming from this space. But you have technicians, hardware, cleaning, repair, operational management, electricians, engineers, and support. Big mines can create anywhere up to 200, sometimes 300 jobs. So there's quite a bit of job potential, jobs being created. And one thing to keep in mind about a lot of these jobs as well is that they are there's little training needed to get someone from not knowing anything about Bitcoin mining, to being able to work in the space. So oftentimes, even if you go to rural communities, you don't need to import talent in order to be successful. You can hire from the local workforce, which in the policy world, political world, people love that. It's really important to be able to hire from the local community, which is something that miners often do. Miners are also investing millions of dollars, if not tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into local communities, and also taking unused buildings, physical infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, and putting it to good use. A couple examples here, you have CleanSpark. We spent $50 million renovating the abandoned Sprint data center and call center in Norcross, Georgia. And then you also have Riot, who is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to continue to further develop their Corsicana site out in Texas. The second one here, out of these 5 points, is environmental cleanup. Bitcoin mining can clean up the environment in several different ways. Those are all tied to its ability to either enhance renewables or to kind of mitigate methane or certain types of emissions. So Bitcoin mining can enhance renewables. It can clean up landfills. It can clean up orphaned and abandoned oil wells, and it can also enhance and clean up agriculture. On the renewable side, something to keep in mind is that all of the components of Bitcoin mining that help renewables, they can help any sort of energy asset, but they help renewables more than any other type of energy asset because the intermittency of wind and solar is probably the biggest downfall of renewables. They're not an on-demand power source, so they need demand response, frequency response, and various other types of programs to be able to help mitigate for the downfall or the shortfall of the fact that they cannot create power all the time. And I'll get into those in a little bit as well. But all the impacts of that helping renewables to be able to be enhanced through Bitcoin mining is a carbon neutral impact on the environment. To the right of that, you see landfills, orphan wells, and agriculture. All of these emit methane, and Bitcoin mining can use methane as a fuel source, which if you take methane and you convert it to CO2, that is a carbon negative impact or CO2e impact. And just something to keep in mind when I say carbon negative, when I'm talking about methane, a lot of us in the Bitcoin space, we say that Bitcoin is can be a unit of account, money is a unit of account. Well, in the environmental space, CO2 is the unit of account. So you don't say, X amount of methane was abated. You calculate everything back into CO2. So in this sort of context, when I say CO2 negative, that's the kind of the measurement tool that I'm using. So landfills, orphan wells, agriculture, anytime you take that methane and you mitigate it, having a great impact on the environment, CO2 negative. On the agriculture side, we also have the potential for waste heat to be used for greenhouses, and also potentially using that excess CO2 to fuel plants within those greenhouses. Okay, so what is methane and why is it a major problem? Methane is a greenhouse gas, and it is roughly 84 times worse over a 20-year period and 27 times worse over a 100-year period than carbon dioxide for warming. So just a little bit of methane can have a very big impact on the warming within our atmosphere. There are various sources of methane. Natural gas and petroleum systems are one. Enteric fermentation is the other. That's like cows basically burping, or you could say pooping and farting, all sorts of different ways that gases leave animal bodies and human bodies. And then also landfills is a very big chunk of that as well. And it's not just me that's claiming that methane is a problem. You have governments around the world that are starting to tackle this issue, starting to realize that it is a major problem. You have 150 nations that have pledged to be able to go after this problem. You have the Biden administration going after it, the IEA going after it, United Nations. Everyone's kind of chipping in and realizing that we need to start focusing on this as an issue. But how does Bitcoin mining help solve the methane problem? So as I mentioned earlier, Bitcoin mining can use methane as a fuel source. What you're doing is you're taking a landfill, you're taking the gas from that landfill, which is the CH4 or methane, natural gas. You're putting it through a generator or a turbine. You're converting that to electricity, and you're using that electricity to mine Bitcoin. Pretty simple. Can mining with methane reduce the emissions profile of Bitcoin? So as I mentioned earlier, everything is calculated in CO2. So we're taking all this back to CO2e. So for every single kilowatt of electricity you create, this chart is used to map how much CO2 you're adding or taking out of the atmosphere. So for coal, every time you create a kilowatt of electricity with coal, you are generating 988 grams of CO2, or in this case, it would be CO2 because coal emits CO2 directly, so it's not a CO2 equivalent. The same is true with natural gas. And then you have solar, nuclear, wind, ocean, and hydro. Now, something to keep in mind, obviously, there's within the supply chain, there are, of course, emissions generated, but this is just talking about when you actually have the device on, when you actually have the coal plant powered up, like how much carbon is being generated by that sort of process. And then below that, you have mitigating flared gas and mitigating vented methane. So flared is, as you guys know, you got the flare stacks. Some of that methane does not actually get mitigated. It still kind of makes its way into the atmosphere. So if you go and you take the flare stack and you run that through a Bitcoin miner, generator or turbine, it's a little bit more efficient of a capture. And so that's why you see that kind of like negative, 1006 kilowatts or negative, 1006 CO2e equivalent of carbon being taken out of the atmosphere. But if you do this, say that same process that we showed back here with the vented methane, which is methane that is not being mitigated at all, it's being just flared, or it's being just vented into the atmosphere, no sort of abatement whatsoever. So for every kilowatt of electricity from that process, you're having a very, very, very carbon negative, extremely carbon negative impact on the environment. Unfortunately, for the most cases where you do have vented methane, it's typically in like small landfills that are under the EPA regulations, or it's in the middle of nowhere and there's no one out there that can really go tackle this problem. But as you all know, and some of you know on this call, Bitcoin mining is highly scalable and doesn't require infrastructure to reach those sorts of nooks and crannies of the world where we're not getting or taking care of all the flared and vented methane that is being emitted into the atmosphere. All right, so one thing to keep in mind as we talk about the emissions profile of Bitcoin mining is how much power it uses and how much estimated megatons of CO2e it's creating every year. So right now, currently, according to Cambridge, which is just the best estimate that we have for power usage, it may be a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower than this, but this is just about as good as we can get right now. Roughly, Bitcoin as a network is using 16.28 gigawatts of electricity. Now, that might sound like a lot, but to keep in mind, that's only 0.22% of global energy usage. And it's also less than the total line loss each year. So as we're distributing electricity across the United States, more power is lost in that process than what the Bitcoin mining network uses. Also, as this is a best estimate up here too, I would say this is on the very high estimate side, 72.32 megatons of CO2e being generated by the Bitcoin network. Even though that is a big number compared to the number I'm about to show you, which I believe is it's a lot closer to the actual number, that still is only 0.15% of global emissions. And it's actually less emissions than the entire tobacco industry generates every year. The tobacco industry generates roughly 250% more emissions than the Bitcoin network. That last one here. So I slapped up this last number. This is where we actually believe the number of emissions to be at for the Bitcoin network is 33.1, roughly, very roughly, megatons of CO2e. This is done after you take into consideration the abatement of flared and vented methane that's occurring, and also taking into consideration some of the off-grid renewable mining that's taking place. So this number over here is a Cambridge number, and even in their methodology, they say that they do not account for off-grid mining. That includes renewables, and that includes any sort of flared or vented Bitcoin mining, which is, as we showed earlier, it's like over here, just a little bit of that can have a very carbon negative impact on Bitcoin mining. So even though many of you on the call might think, oh, there's not that much flared or vented methane mining occurring in the Bitcoin space, it doesn't require that much for it to be able to knock this number down. And also, there's many of us who are mining off grid with renewables, and that's taking that number into consideration as well. All right, so when you're looking at that number, the 33.1 megatons of CO2e, we also want to still, do what we can to try to mitigate that number. At least policymakers across the country are trying to figure out how that they can reduce their emissions profile. And the question is, how do we accomplish that with Bitcoin mining without actually having to go and do any sort of carbon credits or renewable energy certificates? How do we mitigate enough methane to be able to drive that number down? We can actually do the math. So it takes roughly 6.6 megawatts of a vented methane site, a vented landfill site. You can see that number down here, to be able to mitigate roughly 1 megaton of CO2e. The same is true for flared, right? Remember, the vented is the one where it's unabated. It's going to be a hugely carbon negative impact, but we need roughly 6.6 megawatts or 2,031 S19 pros to mitigate 1 megaton of CO2e. So if you do the math, moving something around here, if you do the math, you need 2,031 machines to vented methane to abate 1 megaton. So what's 2,031 times 33.1, which is the total emissions profile of the Bitcoin network? That's roughly 67,226 machines. So 67,226 machines, new machines. Well, there's some newer stuff now, right? This is a little bit outdated, so we could probably get a little bit better numbers with the XPs. That will turn the entire Bitcoin network carbon neutral if you're able to achieve this. Or you need 6.6 megawatts generated by vented methane to abate it. So 6.6 times 33.1 is 218.5 megawatts, which really is not that big of a number. But again, keep in mind, a very small amount of vented methane mitigated by Bitcoin mining can have an extremely powerful carbon negative CO2e impact on the Bitcoin mining network. So what are the sources of vented methane in the USA? Like, is this even a problem? Is there even enough methane out there for us to tackle this? There are, and yes, the answer is yes, and there are several sources. Oil and gas industries emit roughly 265 billion cubic meters each year. Some of that is from flared and some of that is from vented. In order to power the entire Bitcoin network, all we need is 25 billion cubic meters. So that's enough just alone from this industry, from the oil and gas industry emitting methane. There's enough methane there to power the Bitcoin network 10 times over. Again, these numbers might, you guys might fact check me in the future and be like, wow, these numbers are way off. The hash rate climbs and drops pretty rapidly at sometimes. So just keep in mind that some of these slides might be a little outdated with the number, but roughly you can power the Bitcoin network 10 times over as of like 2 or 3 months ago with this number. Also, couple other big sources of methane in the United States. Landfills are a huge problem. 17% overall of all the emissions generated from methane in the United States comes from landfills. 1,400 landfills in the United States, by best estimates, have no sort of gas capture system in them because they fall below the EPA regulations. EPA kind of has certain mandates where if you have an X, your landfill is X size, then you are forced to have some sort of mitigation. But 1,400 of those landfills have no mitigation whatsoever. So if a Bitcoin miner were to go in, that's all vented methane that you could be capturing and having a very carbon negative impact. The same problem exists with orphaned and abandoned oil wells, which emit roughly 263,000 metric tons of methane or 6.6 million metric tons of CO2e. You can see this map. There are major hot zones for orphaned and abandoned oil wells. They've done estimates to say there's like, tens of thousands of these orphaned and abandoned oil wells, which are basically wells that have been abandoned by oil and gas producers, maybe because of a boom and bust cycle, who knows? But somebody has to take care of them so that they get put back in the custody of the state, and then the state has to manage them. Well, because there's so many of them and they're all over the place, it's a very difficult problem to try to solve or try to have a solution for. So we actually at Satoshi Action Fund have policy, and it is active in Texas, and we're waiting for a hearing for it. But what it'll allow Bitcoin miners to go in, take over the sites where there's actually the ability to produce on top of and mitigate those sites. And there's actually even like monies available for folks to be able to get those mining operations up and going, because you're not going to go in and take over an abandoned oil and gas well unless there's some sort of incentive to do so. So we're trying to create that program in Texas right now. But they've estimated, Environmental Defense Fund, EPA, there's tens of thousands, but some people believe that number could be in the millions, because many times these abandoned wells, they just don't even go registered. Nobody even reports them. So I had a friend the other day who was chopping down grass to make a pathway for a road in Texas, and they came right across an abandoned oil and gas well. No one even knew it was there. So there are many of those all over the country. And another thing to keep in mind is when people are like, well, why would anyone want to tackle methane? Why don't we just stay grid connected? There are some OpEx costs with getting vented and flared gas mining going, which are a little bit higher barrier to entry. But the upside of when you are mining off of methane is that you have a cheaper fuel source potentially, and also potentially more reliably low cost fuel, depending on whether what your contract is set up. But in the case of like going after landfills or going after orphan and abandoned oil wells, you're going to be locking in those prices once you bid on those orphan and abandoned oil wells, and also once you set up whatever it is with the landfill, so to speak, right? You could be doing a profit share. Who knows? I've worked with guys like Vethbean. That's kind of their approach, but it really gives them the ability to. They do a profit share, and it on the high side they're paying a little bit more, but on the low side they're protected. So that's really valuable in the space. We know we have lots of boom and bust cycles in the Bitcoin mining space. So on the downside, you're highly protected potentially if you set up your contracts appropriately. So that's another incentive to potentially go after this source. And again, the craziest part, the most interesting part is that it's not just me, it's not just some methane miners running around wildcatting on top of this stuff. It is the White House itself even saying and admitting that crypto mining operations that capture vented methane to produce electricity can yield positive results for the climate. Okay, that was a big chunk, a lot to take in. I'm going to probably move a little bit faster on some of these next sections, but I wanted to really nail that one for you guys. I think it's important story to tell when you're talking about the environmental potential of Bitcoin.
There's a question here specific to that previous section. Do you want to answer it now, or would you like to wait till the end? Totally up to you.
I can answer it now. It's fine.
Okay, so this one is there a Bitcoin methane mitigation calculator available for both miners, investors, and politicians? So something that would help people kind of, articulate this from a
there is on the EPA website. I don't know what the link is, but if you go and you just type in like EPA emissions calculator, you absolutely can find that one. It takes a little bit of learning on how to use it, but yes, there is definitely a calculator that you can use.
Okay, so maybe there's not one specific to Bitcoin mining, kind of, but there is one for emissions.
Yeah, I mean, but it is the same thing, right? Like if you take methane that's being unabated and you abate that methane, like you can go and calculate it. There's calculators that show you how much of a CO2e impact you're having. The environmental, I think there's multiple environmental groups that have those, but I'm fairly confident that there's one for that. I know there is one for that on the EPA website.
Yeah.
If you just Google EPA emissions calculator, it'll show you that.
Yeah, Jerome. So he answered it, and he actually dropped the link in there as well.
There we go. Perfect.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Jerome.
that. And then that was the only one for this section, so feel free to move on.
All right. Grid benefits. Yeah, great question, by the way. Thank you. That's really important to be able to calculate that. Grid benefits. Let's see if I can get it to click here. There we go. So there are 5 grid benefits, key grid benefits that Bitcoin mining can offer. And one thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that all of these are good for every type of energy generation asset, but they are very, very good for renewables. Again, because of renewables intermittency. So you have number 1, location agnostic infrastructure. Number 2, curtailment from renewable energy generation. Number 3, keeping renewable generation online. And number 4, demand response. And number 5, frequency response. This one's very simple. I'm not going to cover it in length. Bitcoin mining can be anywhere, right? You can place it anywhere. You don't need infrastructure to attach to it. You basically just need a very, very weak internet signal, although better internet signal is good, but it's not required for Bitcoin mining. Curtailment from renewable generation. This is a really interesting and important section because just like how with the flared and vented methane, which is waste energy, the same problem is occurring with much of our renewable energy generation. And what is curtailment? Curtailment is the reduction of output of renewable resources below what it could have otherwise produced. So if wind has the potential to be generating, but they are turning it off because no one needs that energy, that's considered curtailment. And that is just wasted energy potential that's just totally being wasted. Same thing happens with solar. It does also sometimes happen with hydro, but it's less common. How much curtailment is taking place? A lot. I'll share just one state with you. There are obviously vast areas of the country who have a lot of wind and solar, but California has a lot of data on this, so it's very easy to show this example. So in California, CAISO, which is their ISO, I'm not going to go into ISOs and RTOs in length, but if you ever want me to, feel free to reach out to me. And we have a very specific interest at Satoshi Action Fund in engaging at the RTO, ISO, and FERC level. So this is a chart of CAISO, which is almost all of California, their energy system. And it's a chart of their curtailment. And as you can see, it is exploding as you move from the left to the right. From 2015 to 2022, there is a lot of curtailment taking place. And in fact, in California right now, there's roughly 2.5 million megawatt hours of wind and solar that are curtailed every single year. But the goal, the interesting part is the goal for California by 2030 is to double its wind and solar deployment, which I'm not going to say like that it's definitely going to double the chart, but let's just take like back of the hand math and assume that if you double the amount of wind and solar on the CAISO grid, that you're probably going to come close to doubling the amount of potential curtailment. So let's assume that if you double that number, you're going to get to almost 5 million megawatt hours by 2030. Well, if you are at 5 million megawatt hours by 2030, that means that you are curtailing more energy than the bottom 36 nations combined. It's an incredible amount of power. You know, they oftentimes try to say, oh, Bitcoin mining uses more energy than X country. It's like, well, there's a lot of power that nobody is using whatsoever. So it doesn't really make sense to say that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy when we are wasting an incredible amount of energy every year. ERCOT kind of has a similar problem. I've had a difficulty kind of verifying the data on it, but there's a very big curtailment problem in Texas and also up through SPP because of a lot of the wind that goes, oftentimes negative power pricing because they can't get rid of it to anybody. Nobody needs it. So why does curtailment happen? There are two major reasons. Either there is too much energy when no one needs it, or there are bottlenecks on the network due to lack of transmission lines. And why is there too much power when no one needs it? There's this thing called the duck curve, which if you're interested, you look it up, Google it, you can kind of read about it in detail. But I'll share the basics of kind of how this works. So this is a chart of the lowest net load day for each year on CAISO. And as you can see, again, from 2015 to 2021, as they've built more solar, particularly solar, wind is included in here as well, you'll see the net demand or the net load drop. And this is bad because it means that you're getting more and more curtailment occurring. And also because of these, see these vast drop downs and up times, during this period, anything that is not solar is doing quite a bit of ramping up and down. Our traditional energy assets, thermal generation assets, were not built, the turbines on those things were not built to be able to manage this sort of generation shedding or uptimes and downtimes. What do they call that? The word is skipping my mind right now. But they are not meant to be able to increase and decrease the amount of energy that they are generating. And so this is causing a lot of problems just outside of wasted energy. So if you take a look at it's called, the word is cycling, I remember it now. So they're not, thermal generation assets were not meant to cycle down and cycle up this way. It's actually damaging the turbines themselves. I've talked to a thermal generation turbine engineer, and we got into long conversations about how much damage is being put, how much wear and tear is being put on these turbines. The interesting thing about it too is, again, that as you see more and more of the net load dropping each day, you're also seeing curtailment pick up. This is an overlay of another chart that is showing within CAISO all of the biggest days of curtailment each year. So you can see there's quite a bit of curtailment taking place because nobody needs this energy. This is in the middle of the day when most people are going to work. So you have your morning peak when people wake up over here, and then it goes across because people are going to work. They're not using their blow dryers. They're not using their TVs. Everybody's working at their offices. There's not as many cars on the road. And then you see it pick up again over here in the evening when a lot of folks are starting to get home, taking showers, watching TV, you name it, cooking their food. But in the middle of the day, there's less demand for energy. And that's when solar creates or generates the most power. So unfortunately, we have not been able to figure out how to solve this problem. Some people say that batteries will solve it. It's a very expensive solution. I think that technology will get better. I do like batteries. I think that batteries and Bitcoin mining will make a lot of sense together in the future. But right now, this is a lot of energy that's being wasted that Bitcoin mining could be soaking up. Obviously I gave you this was how does Bitcoin mining solve the excess generation problem? Pretty simple. You have Bitcoin mining coming in, soaking up excess load and curtailing when there's not enough generation. Same problem, same outcome, different reason why it's occurring. You have curtailment problems that are occurring because of transmission line problems that don't get built out enough. I'm going to skip through this section, but basically the premise is you have wind and solar in the middle of nowhere, and you have transmission lines that are not being built quickly enough to get the energy to market. Bitcoin miners could be going in and soaking up that excess generation. Same thing is occurring with renewables that are losing their PPAs, their original off-takers. So you'll typically, when you build a wind and solar and energy generation asset, you'll have an initial off-taker. Well, what happens when those initial off-takers go away? It's oftentimes very difficult to find a new one. Well, that's where Bitcoin miners come in, and they can help keep these renewable energy generation assets online. It's not just me making these ideas up either. This is the former interim CEO of ERCOT, which is Texas's grid, speaking at length about how Bitcoin miners are keeping renewable energy generation assets online. Happy to share this slide and that video with you if you're interested in listening to it. All right, demand response. Another benefit of Bitcoin mining. We hear a lot about this, so I won't cover it in length. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about demand response on this call. The basic premise of demand response is that you have, in the past, had a grid where, in order to be able to make sure that you do not go over your capacity, which is really bad, if you go over your electrical grid capacity, the grid will collapse. So you cannot have that happen. So what you have to do is find ways to make sure it doesn't happen. In the past, we've used gas peaker plants, flywheels, pumped hydro, gravitational thermal energy. Batteries are a more nascent solution, more newer solution to make sure that this problem doesn't occur. Because if you go over, again, your grid will collapse. So you have to find any solution possible to make sure that doesn't happen. However, these solutions are all very expensive. So just keep that in mind. A new program that's been developed to try to solve that problem is demand response. The basic premise of demand response is that instead of asking for to import power or to build a peaker plant or to build new infrastructure to manage these sorts of peak moments, you ask customers instead to curtail their usage. And you see that here happening in New England ISO. Instead of going over, which this is the forecasted demand, going over the available capacity, there's, instead of saying like, oh, let's go import power from Virginia or down south, they instead ask some large load customers to curtail, and you can see that happening successfully here during that demand response event. How do Bitcoin mining data centers compare as a demand response resource? I'll just tell you that they're the best. It's not close. There's no second best, as Michael Saylor would say. I've talked to FERC, like former economists, and I explained Bitcoin mining to them, and they're basically like, if what you're saying is true, Bitcoin mining is inarguably the best demand response resource on the planet. So and we're going to be trying to do a lot of research to help prove that point. I'll share some of these with you guys who want in the future. These are just charts kind of proving my point. One important part about demand response I think is important to keep in mind was that it's taking place quite regularly in ERCOT. In fact, ERCOT has started to recognize Bitcoin mining as a resource on their grid. They call it large flexible load, which is this area right here. They believe there's roughly 1,700 megawatts of, 1,700 megawatts, roughly 1.7 gigawatts of Bitcoin mining taking place within that program. And in November, they did this resource study. And then in December, Winter Storm Elliott hit. And you had Bitcoin miners return roughly 1,500 megawatts of power back to the grid, which is enough power to heat 1.5 million small homes or enough power to energize 300 large hospitals. This is a really important story to tell. I think if you're going to tell the ones I would say, to whether it be policymakers, regulators, your friends, your family, environmentalists, anyone you want to convince that this technology is very valuable, this is probably my favorite use case. If they don't care about like the environment and they don't care about emissions, then it's absolutely this story. Because you have miners, which are a business that want to be up all the time, but are willing to shut down and can shut down in the middle of storms. That doesn't happen. There's no business model like that. If you try to shut down a Google or Amazon data center, the whole network will have all sorts of problems. Customers' calls will drop. You'll have videos drop. You'll have your video. If you try to buy or sell crypto online, you're going to run into all sorts of issues, right? Because all of that, the functions of the internet are depending on these data centers. Well, in the case of Bitcoin mining, because all Bitcoin miners are doing the same thing all across the entire world in a decentralized manner, you can shut down, and this chart shows, you can shut down roughly 25, 30% of the network, and Bitcoin mining will still, or excuse me, Bitcoin will still function, right? Because Bitcoin miners are operating all over the country in all over the world in unison. So this is really, really important. No one else can do this. Return 1,500 megawatts to the grid in the middle of an emergency when ratepayers need it the most. It's a really important story to tell, especially because oftentimes in the news and the media, we get this like, oh, Bitcoin mining is, it's bad. It's taking up all the energy. It's like, no, like we are using the energy when you don't need it. And we are more than willing and ready and happy to shut down in the middle of a deadly winter, potentially deadly winter storm, right? Because it wasn't, because some could argue that it was less deadly because Bitcoin miners shut down and returned that power to people who needed it the most. So I cannot reiterate enough that this is a very important story to tell. If you want to go to satoshi.action.io, you can go there, and there is, in our learning section, I wrote an entire breakdown of how this happened, what happened, and you can share that with your friends and family. Please do, because it's super important for people to understand the potential of this technology in this way. This is just data proving that it happened, because people be like, well, how do you know it happened? Even ERCOT and Lancium and various other software providers have shared evidence that it occurred. This is Lancium's software that tracked it occurring on the grid, and this is ERCOT itself, shared this slide showing that Bitcoin miners responded on December 23rd during the middle of that winter storm. And it's not the only time this has happened, and I don't think it's going to be the only time that it happens going into the future. The summer before that, Bitcoin miners also returned 1,000 megawatts during that heat wave in Texas. So this is the old this is the old electrical grid without Bitcoin mining. And this is the new electrical grid with Bitcoin mining. Now, instead of having to import power, instead of having to build expensive peaker plants, carbon intensive peaker plants, you can now reliably depend, which is a critical word when you're talking to energy, particularly like electrical energy infrastructure folks. Reliability is the most important term, especially as we head towards a world with renewables, where energy infrastructure has become less and less reliable. As we depend less on traditional infrastructure to balance the grid, we need new ways of doing that, and it has been difficult to do. So reliability is very important when you talk to these people in the energy world. And now you have this reliable customer who can turn off vast amounts of power whenever, wherever you need. And I, again, cannot reiterate how just important and huge that is, not only for the fact that you can reduce the need for the expensive carbon intensive peaker plants, but you can also make sure that customers are keeping their lights on, keeping their heaters on in the middle of a heat wave, or in the middle of a winter storm, keeping their air conditioner on in the middle of a heat wave. Huge. And how do they stack up against other data centers? I already kind of mentioned that Amazon and Google data centers can't really do any of these sorts of functions, but there's other functions that they can't match Bitcoin on. So Bitcoin mining can co-locate next to green energy projects. Amazon and Google cannot. Bitcoin mining can perform ancillary services by winding up and down for responses to emergencies, you name it. Amazon and Google cannot, at least not the whole thing, right? Like they can do maybe like turn the lights. Google will even be like, oh, we can turn the lights off in our offices. It's not enough power. No one cares. Bitcoin mining can turn down and return from a single site potentially hundreds of megawatts of power. So Amazon and Google cannot do that. And it also can scale down to spatial constraints. Amazon and Google, it's always big, all the time. Very specific geographic land use requirements. Bitcoin mining can scale down to tiny, tiny little nooks and crannies and crevices, and be able to capture wasted methane and also wasted wind and solar energy potential. All right, frequency response is the last one here, and I'll pretty much be done with the presentation. I'm going to cover this one quickly, even though I shouldn't. I'm running slow on time. So what is frequency response and why does it matter? So we talked about demand response. That's kind of like the big brother. This is like the little brother. Frequency response is less about supply and demand, and it's more about controlling the heartbeat of the grid. The heartbeat of the grid is 60 hertz per second, which means that you have to maintain that number if it goes up or down, too high or too low. Obviously, if your own heartbeat goes too high, you can die. If it goes too low, you can die. Same thing with the grid. You cannot let the frequency number go too high or too low. Now, that is impacted by supply and demand on the grid, but it's less concerned about that. It's more concerned about just maintaining that 60 hertz number. The grid must be kept at that number at all times. Small deviations are okay, very small. If you cannot maintain that number, what will happen is grid operators will perform rolling brownouts and blackouts. Like, this is the thing that people need to understand about energy infrastructure. If you see rolling brownouts and blackouts, it's because they were not able to maintain this number on the grid. And what they were doing is, instead of saying, all right, well, we're just going to let the grid collapse, what they did was like, all right, we're going to preemptively wind down power in specific parts of our grid to ensure that it maintains stability. Because again, if they don't do those things, if the grid operators don't take those actions, you'll have what's called a system-wide outage or a black start, which is very, very bad. System-wide outage, black start is worst case scenario for grid operators. I don't think we've seen one, like an actual system-wide outage, for at least over a decade in this country, maybe longer, because they'll do, like, literally, again, they'll do anything. They'll keep your power out for days to make sure the whole system itself actually kind of is still operating. If you don't do that and you have a system-wide outage, it can take weeks just to get the power back online. And in the meantime, worst case scenario, you're having your food go bad in the fridge. Best case scenario, you're having your food go bad in the fridge. Worst case scenario, people are dying all within that area that was impacted. So there are various ways to kind of respond to this problem of any sort of frequency deviations. I'll let you dive into that in your own time. It gets a little technical, but basically there are three ways to control frequency. There's primary frequency control, secondary frequency control, and tertiary frequency control. The difference between the three of them is primarily how quickly they can respond. And how is frequency managed in the past? This is important because we used to manage frequency one way, and now we're managing it, or need to manage it, a totally different way, again, because of the advent of wind and solar generation assets on our grid. So in the past, you have thermal generation, which is all controlled by these giant turbines. You have steam, which is created through heating up water, whether that be from a nuclear site, heating up water, could be from coal, could be from gas. They all are heating up water, shoving it through the turbine, and then spinning the generator to create electricity. And the interesting thing about that process is all of those thermal generation assets on the grid. So let's say you have an area that's a size of like 100 square miles, and you've got 10 thermal turbines on that area. They're all spinning like in unison. They're all matched together, and they're all spinning at 60 hertz per, or 60 rotations per second. If there's any sort of deviation in the past, what would happen is you would see this governor right here with these two spheres on the end of it. If the frequency starts to go up too high or drop because either load comes offline or generation comes offline, this system automatically detects that and opens this valve right here to either let more steam in, or it will close it and let less steam in. And that keeps all of the turbines spinning at the exact same speed. No one needs to push a button. No one needs to do anything. The object in motion will just stay in motion, and there's nothing that needs to be done to be able to try to compensate for any sort of frequency deviations. Well, the problem is we're adding things like wind and solar onto the grid, which are not connected to that system. And so whenever there's any sort of deviation, let's say like a wind or solar asset comes online or offline, which happens very regularly because they're an intermittent energy source, it creates massive problems for people in the grid, grid operators in particular. In fact, I was just talking to a gentleman in academia who studies this problem. And even though he's pro-environment, he's just like, these assets like destroy our grid. And in fact, there's a whole wing of people within the energy infrastructure world, in the regulatory world, who just are like, wind and solar are terrible, and we should not build any more of them because they're going to destroy our grid. There's actually a fair argument for that. And it's also part of the reason why so many people that are very supportive of wind and solar are extremely supportive of batteries, because they see batteries as a potential solution for their energy generation assets' largest problem, right? So one thing to keep in mind is that there are other ways to solve the problems that wind and solar create on the grid outside of batteries. And I personally believe that Bitcoin mining has the best potential to solve that problem. So because Bitcoin mining, again, can wind up and down and do it rapidly, some can do it in short period of time. Some people are doing it, they say, within a minute. I have talked to other folks who said that they have the technology to be able to get in front of the signal and actually respond to a frequency deviation in less than a second, which I haven't seen happen, right? And people are saying that's not possible, but some folks are working on that. And if we can get it down to that zero or close to zero, it means that we can be one of the most important response resources, load resources for any sort of frequency deviations. And again, I guess something I missed was when frequency deviations occur, you have to respond very rapidly. You can't wait. And the faster you can respond, the better. And also, the more programmatically you can respond, the better. Because if you're responding to a frequency deviation by turning a power plant on or off, you're going to notice, like, for instance, like up here, you'll see like, oh, we overcompensated. We got to curtail a little bit. Oh, we went down too far. All right. And they're trying to like find that balance again, right? And it can take a little bit of work. All of these different types of, I'll go back, all of these different types of responses, see how they all are like trying to find that balance. They're trying to find the right spot, and it takes a little bit of work. But because Bitcoin miners are, potentially 3.5 kilowatts per miner, you can just programmatically be like, boom, this is exactly how much we need, deploy it, done. And that's really important for grid operators as well as they're trying to manage frequency deviation. So I personally believe that in the future, as we develop better software and the ability to respond, the Bitcoin miners will be one of the best frequency response resources on the planet. All right, that's pretty much it. So yeah, actually I'll stop there. I think that's good because then I can answer some questions. I covered a lot. Starting to think that I maybe should expand this presentation to 50 minutes, not 40 minutes, because I feel like I'm talking extremely fast. So hopefully you all are able to take that in and able to absorb some of that information. I'm happy to take any questions if you guys have them.
Yeah. Before we dive in that, Dennis, thank you for running through this. Like you said, tons of information here, enough to riff on for a long time. One of the things I really appreciated was, I think a lot of the different angles you're coming at this from is very focused on the audience, right? So if it's someone who's very particular to the electrical infrastructure, you kind of have an argument that they can understand. If they're more on the political side of the aisle, you have an argument they can understand. All of them in favor of more mining, more proof of work systems. So I think it's a great position. So let's dive into the Q&A. There's only really a couple questions. We were able to answer a couple. And then if anyone's interested, I didn't realize this, but we can actually turn your mic on if you want to ask a live question as well. So first one is really just people want to know if there's any way they can get their hands on this presentation or something like it. There's a couple of them. Couple people saying excellent presentation, thank you. And then yeah, so the first question is, any way we could get a copy of this presentation to the audience? We are recording the session, so maybe that's an option. Dennis, we'll leave that to you. But
yeah, I don't generally share the whole presentation. You're happy to have you share the recording.
Okay.
Or if the person that's interested in in getting a copy, if you have a group that you're wishing to share the presentation with, I'm happy to also present to that group as well. If you have some folks, and that goes for anybody in the room. If you can get a small group of people together, I like to present on this as much as I can, and helps keep the presentation fresh because I have to work on it a little bit every time. Also helps keep me fresh on presenting it as well. So if you have a group that you ever want me to present this to, I'm happy to do so, but I don't share the deck itself with anyone.
Okay, so we can share the recording for Robert and Ed, just so you are good to go there. So this question's from Lannon. I'm just going to read it. It says, concentrated power and influence runs the risk of corruption. In the spirit of Bitcoin, how can you scale your efforts but maintain decentralization of influence? Parentheses, avoid the Dennis Porter Show scenario. So would love to hear you riff on that for a bit, Dennis.
Yeah, I think that, we've seen a lot of potential centralization of Bitcoin mining in the past. In China, there was quite a bit more hash rate than there is here today. And I think in the United States, I think we still have quite a bit of room to grow. But I'm also working, through Satoshi Action Education. So I have two entities, Satoshi Action Fund and Satoshi Action Education. Satoshi Action Education is a global nonprofit. We focus on education and research that can be able to advance Bitcoin mining potentially across the entire world. So we do have an interest in trying to make sure that folks in the global South, you name it, are able to be able to benefit from this technology. Hopefully we can help countries like El Salvador be able to move the right direction, as rapidly as possible as it pertains to being able to adopt Bitcoin mining and specific regulatory policies. Because oftentimes people think, oh, well, Bitcoin mining is just a business. I see it much more as a piece of energy infrastructure that enables a new wave of regulatory policy. And so if you are just mining Bitcoin, in El Salvador, that's not the full benefit that you can have. You could potentially be, creating more energy independence for the country there and reducing energy prices if you combine Bitcoin mining with very specific regulatory policies like demand response and various other types of ancillary service programs.
All right. Appreciate that. So we have two more. I'm gonna see. One of them wants to ask a live question. So if we'll do that one right after the last Q&A. So the last one in the actual Q&A, then we'll do the live question and we'll have to kill it. Is what do you think the biggest political challenges are for us to overcome in the next few years to ensure stable Bitcoin mining businesses can continue without issues? How can we overcome them?
Yeah, it's definitely any sort of discrimination against Bitcoin mining, because there's such a lack of education on the issue that we're going to need to make sure politically that we go in and provide protections for Bitcoin miners. That's one of the biggest and most important missions of Satoshi Action Fund, and that's what we've been doing. So that's why we have the Mining Protection Act, which has been dubbed the Right to Mine Act. And we've passed that in the House and Senate in Arkansas and Montana. And we want to see a lot more states take that policy and move forward with it. We think we're going to get at least 2 more states to pass it this year outside of Arkansas and Montana. So that's a key goal. And if you want to see that work done, I mean, get on a call with me and ask me how we can get it done. Most oftenly, I'm going to tell you that we need folks to get behind us and support the work that we're doing. If you want to meet me in person, learn more about what we're doing, we do have some events coming up. So I will be in Miami, in and around Miami for BTC 23. And then I'll also be at Mining Disrupt. We're going to be going very, 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 very big for Mining Disrupt. So if you're thinking about going to Mining Disrupt, I would be absolutely trying to figure out how to get a booth there, how to get on a panel there, how to go and get a ticket to that, because that's where I think you're going to see a lot of miners put all their chips onto the table this year.
Awesome.
Not seeing as much of that take place at BTC 23, but definitely for Mining Disrupt. And
everyone who's joined or registered, we will share Dennis's contact info and kind of in a follow-up email. So you'll have, if you want to get a hold of him, Satoshi Action, all that stuff. Really quickly, but while we have time, someone wants to try a live question and I'm open to it as well. So Ben K, I'm about to click the allow you to talk button. We'll go from there. So, you can do your video too if you want, but we'll just go audio now. How's it going, Ben?
Okay. Hey, Tom. Hey, Dennis. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. As an engineer, I really like the technical aspect of it, really, really detailed. My question is, how do you think that all those use cases you presented are going to change the mining environment we see now? Right now, we had some kind of centralization with really big mining farms running on grid energy. Do you think it will evolve into a decentralized mining environment plugged to direct energy sources like methane generators, renewables, etc.? And do you think that the operators that will do that will be the same, or are they already too big to change their business model?
I think you're going to see, yeah, that's a really great question. I definitely think you're going to see, more decentralization happen naturally because of the economics of mining. Like right now you're seeing a lot of the, and I could be wrong, so this is kind of just my opinion, but you're seeing a lot of those bigger, sources of energy taken up. You're seeing like the excess energy that could be that potential being soaked up. I think you'll continue to kind of see that happen for a little while, but then you're going to start to see that, Bitcoin mining start to, get into those nooks and crannies. And I think also be, viewed more so as energy infrastructure. A lot of people are viewing this as a business. And it is like everything, even energy infrastructure is a business, but I think that viewing it as a piece of energy infrastructure is really important, because that's where you're going to start to see the most, I think, growth in the future, especially as they start to realize that they can just co-locate these things next to wind and energy assets, co-locate it right onto a substation, so to speak. And then also with the advent of any sort of methane mining, which is never going to be large, like you're never going to have, multi-hundred megawatt methane mine, and that's going to further decentralize the network. And as you're doing that, you're also taking it off grid, which I think is another important component to kind of protecting and decentralizing the network as well. And the thing I like about, people ask me too a lot, the thing I like about the United States is, even though it's, you have the federal government over top, and it's very powerful, you do have states which have a lot of autonomy. And that's the reason why we go to the states and try to advance in the states, because you can have a lot of wins there, very much like the marijuana industry, which went state by state to be able to advocate for their space, despite being a federal crime. They were able to pass pro-marijuana legislation and legalize marijuana in 75% of the country. And they're probably going to get the rest of the country, just a matter of time, in my opinion. I think we can do that same thing. The Bitcoin mining industry is go protect the industry at the state level, advance it at the state level. And eventually it gets to the point where there's just not a whole lot DC can do, especially if they don't have the political capital to be able to expel.
Awesome. Hey, Ben,
Thanks.
hopefully that answered your question. Appreciate you hopping
Definitely.
on. Glad that worked. So I'm gonna disable talking right there. Okay, cool. All right, so I think we're at time. We've run a little bit over. Want to thank everybody for joining. This has been, awesome. Had some great questions. Dennis, really appreciate your time kind of running through that. I think there's a lot more to unpack here. So, maybe we could do more of these in the future, diving into specific components of what you're working on and the mining industry. But again, want to thank everybody. What we'll do is after this, we will share information that you might think is interesting. So we'll send you an email about stuff about Satoshi Action, anything you might want to know, and we'll also try to share the recording somewhere that you can access it as well. So really appreciate it. And Dennis, any final thoughts before we jump here?
No, that's great. I'd love if anyone wants to go to satoshiaction.io. You can check out all the work we're doing on our proof of work page. And we'll have some events coming up. If you want to participate in the dinners we're doing, we're going to have a big dinner, kind of like poker style tournament that we're doing in for Mining Disrupt. So if anybody wants to participate in that, we'd love to have you join and learn more about what we're doing.
All right. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for joining. Take care, guys.